who help plan and organize this series, who reach out to potential speakers and coordinate with them, and who advertise in social media and make sure that the series information is up to date on the website. Shashank is joining us today as co-host and will help us with a Q&A session at the end. Hi, Shashank. What is the plan?
Thanks, Michelle, and hi, everyone. This is Shashank. We want to ensure that the session that we are having today is as interactive as possible. So please feel free to post your questions as they come. Michelle and I will be monitoring them, so you don't need to wait till the end. And if you prefer, you can also unmute yourself and ask the questions directly. And for those people who have joined us via live stream on YouTube, we'll also keep an eye on it for questions there. So yeah, please be as free in asking questions, and your participation is highly encouraged and valued.
Thank you very much, Shashank. Well, our speaker today is Dr. John Mayer, scientist in charge and research hydrologist with the U.S. Geological Survey Cascades Volcano Observatory in Vancouver, Washington. He received his bachelor's from the University of Dayton, his master's from Penn State, and his PhD from the Department of Geological Science at the University of Washington. His research focuses on hydrogeomorphic responses to landscape disturbances, particularly in volcanic river systems. And he has worked in groundwater flow, in landslides, mechanics of deposition by debris flows, post-eruption sediment transport and stream flow hydrology, geomorphic responses to dam removals, and analysis of debris flows and flood hazards at volcanoes in Washington, Oregon, Alaska, and El Salvador, Chile, and the Philippines. Dr. Mayer, please take it away.
Thanks, Michelle. Let's see, let me go ahead and share my screen here. I wanted to make sure we shared screen too. Share. And let's see. And we have to do that. Okay. Can everybody see the PowerPoint?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, great. Thanks. All right. Well, good day, everybody. Whatever time zone you happen to be dialing in from, I really appreciate your interest in the topic. And I want to thank the EPSP committee for inviting me to give this presentation. Kind of what I hope to be able to do today is give you a little bit of a broad brush overview of volcanic processes and their geomorphic impacts and effects. And hopefully by the end of the slideshow, you'll have a little bit better idea of the kinds of things that explosive volcanic eruptions can do to the landscape and how the landscape responds to that, and some of the issues that society has to deal with sometimes for a really long time. The kind of the broad outline of the talk today will be to discuss the landscape impacts that are caused by volcanic eruptions, to take a little bit of a look at the common hydrologic and geomorphic responses to those impacts. We'll talk a little bit about magnitudes of post-eruption sediment transport, and then we'll briefly look at some of the efforts that society has taken to try to mitigate the sediment problems caused by these volcanic events. So I'm just going to open up a little bit here just to say that volcanic eruptions can do a lot of things. They can impact the landscape in a great variety of ways. We can take all these volcanic processes and we can kind of bin them into sort of two major bins. One bin we'll call the flow processes, and those are the things that sweep down the landscape, go down channels, things like that. And then the other one we'll call the processes that we'll lump into what we call the fall category. And these are things that are lofted into the air and either fall immediately back to the ground, or the material gets lofted into the air and then gets carried pretty far downwind. And close to the volcano, as I said, and you can see in this cartoon here on the left, many things can impact the landscape around the volcano, close to the volcano, and they can impact that landscape within minutes to hours. As we move farther away from a volcano, the numbers of things that affect the types and numbers of processes that affect the landscape diminish, but they can And then it also takes longer for them to affect that landscape and to affect society. So, for example, volcanic mud flows, which are called lahars in volcanic language, can travel many, many tens of kilometers downstream, and they can affect areas at those distances within spans of, say, tens of minutes to hours. Volcanic ash fall, or what we call tephra fall, can be carried many hundreds of kilometers downwind or more, and usually takes sort of hours to affect those areas. And we'll talk about each of these in a little more detail shortly. And then, as we've learned really over the last several decades, all this sediment that gets deposited on the landscape is very easily erodible, and it can lead to unstable channels. And a lot of this excess sediment can get flushed out of the landscape over years to decades. So let's just take a look at some of the key processes that affect the landscape. And first one we'll take a look at is what we call a debris avalanche, which is just a very large landslide off the flank of a volcano. It really kind of guts a volcano commonly. And so it can displace vast amounts of sediment from the volcano, vast amounts of material. The photograph there that you see on the right of Mount St. Helens in 1980 removed about 2.5 cubic kilometers of the volcano through a large debris avalanche. These deposits of these debris avalanches can cover really broad areas. They can completely smother valleys and reset the topography of valley systems. They can block tributary channels and impound lakes, as you can see in that middle photograph there at Mount St. Helens. And because those dams are not engineered dams, sometimes those blockages can breach, causing secondary flood and lahar hazards downstream. So these large debris avalanches can actually trigger sort of this cascading set of hazards and sediment hazards that set a lot of things in motion and really impact the landscape. Just to give you a sense of what one of these can look like, this is a time-lapse video that was put together from a series of time-lapse photographs taken of Mount St. Helens from the east. And so you can see this. We have kind of a couple different blocks. We call them the slide blocks of the Mount St. Helens avalanche coming off. So it started to go, and then another block came down. And as this big debris avalanche came off the volcano, it basically released all the pressure on the magmatic body that was up in the volcano, and it set in motion kind of this cascading series of events that had an enormous impact both on the landscape and society. Another process that can have tremendous impact on the landscape are what we call pyroclastic density currents. These are hot, mobile, very destructive flow, hot, dry flows of gas and ash and rock particles. They can sweep across the landscape, sometimes many, many kilometers to maybe even, a couple tens of kilometers. They have incredibly severe vegetation impacts. They can damage, they can completely strip the landscape down to bedrock in places. They can damage, topple, and remove the vegetation. And they can drape the landscape with a lot of loose volcanic sediment. And in some cases, just like a big debris avalanche, they can also very thickly fill valleys with sediment. And in the lower left there, you see a photograph from Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. All that tan color is pyroclastic flow deposit. And in the area of that rock knob that's kind of poking up in the middle of all that, those deposits in that area are probably on the order of 100 meters thick. And just to give you a sense of what some of these look like, this is a photograph from Mount St. Helens in the summer of 1980, but this is some video footage of a variety of eruptions. And I just I'll let this play a little bit. It'll just give you a little bit of a sense of what these things look like when they're coming down the landscape. So they can form by material that's lofted into the air that is denser than the ambient atmosphere and comes falling back down. Lava domes can crumble and fail and set some of these things in motion, as you see here. I believe this is footage from Unzen volcano in Japan, another dome collapse. This is probably, this might be Sinabung volcano in Indonesia. Again, So you can see that there are these kind of these hot flows. They loft a lot of material into the atmosphere, but these things just kind of sweep across the landscape, cause a lot of damage, and people are not going to outrun these things or outdrive them. So you have to evacuate if this is a possibility, but they can cause a lot of damage to the landscape. Another process that is active during explosive volcanic eruptions, especially at snow-clad volcanoes, are what we call lahars, or volcanic debris flows, or volcanic mud flows. These are slurries of rock, sand, mud, water, and debris. They can bury and demolish everything along their path. They'll fill and drape the channels that they flow down, and often because these are very sandy, they generally tend to smooth out the channels, smooth out the roughness, and so they have a pretty significant impact on channel hydraulics, which then has cascading effect on subsequent flow and flooding along the channel and the dynamics of river floods. And just to give you a sense of what one of these things might look like, this is a video from Semeru volcano in Indonesia. This is a very small lahar, and I'll run this video just to give you a sense of what one of these things can look like. And what I want you to take out of this video is, first of all, how fast it's moving, just kind of the textural consistency of the flow as it goes by, and the size of the particles that are being transported. And again, maximum depth of this thing is maybe about 1 meter.
Tu peux te pousser, monter un tout petit peu s'il te plaît?
Okay, so hopefully you have a little better idea of what these things can look like as they come down the channels. They can transport a lot of very coarse material. A lot of that coarse material is often concentrated near the front of the flow and along the margins. And you saw that the body, kind of the tailing part of the flow, is more fluid, generally sandier. And so that's why you can kind of fill and drape channels and affect the channel hydraulics. Another process that we talk about that can affect the landscape here from explosive volcanic eruptions is what we call tephra-fall, or people often call it volcanic ash fall. And it just represents shattered rock, glass, mineral fragments that are lofted into the atmosphere and then carried downwind by these large volcanic plumes. Ash are the particles that are less than 2 millimeters. So when people, at least in the volcanological community, when they talk about volcanic ash, they're talking about particles less than about 2 millimeters. These plumes can travel long distances downwind. This fallout from these plumes can cover very large areas. It can drape the landscape with fine layers of very low permeability sediment. If it happens to be really laden with pumice and pumice particles, those pumice particles will cover the landscape and actually promote the infiltration. But we'll focus a little bit on the finer layers. So you can just these are just some photographs showing you a little bit about kind of some of the landscape impacts that are caused by this volcanic, the fallout of this volcanic material across the landscape. So one of the key concepts I want you to just take away from this right now is that these large explosive eruptions
Well,
And
John, we lost you for a second.
yes, can you share your screen one more
Yeah,
time,
please share again and
Mhm.
unmute yourself. You had just started saying one of the key concepts that you want us to take away. You're still muted, so please also unmute yourself.
unmute. Okay, that's
Yeah.
interesting. I'm not quite sure what happened there. Okay,
It's okay.
let me reshare the screen. And screen 2. Let's see. Click that one. All right, let me get the PowerPoint going again.
We're ready.
Okay, all back to where we were.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, interesting. I have no idea what happened there. Let me just make sure I'm on that screen so that I can actually advance the slides. Okay. All right. So as I was saying, one of the key concepts from that we've learned about explosive volcanic eruptions is that they can disturb landscapes over really broad areas. They can deliver massive inputs of sediment to river systems and to hillsides as well. And they can trigger kind of cascading sediment hazards. The loading on the landscape can either be instantaneous through kind of a single explosive eruption, or if we have prolonged eruptions and repeated eruptions, we can kind of persistently load the landscape. So, so it can be instantaneous or it can be kind of prolonged over a period of time. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a look at the hydrologic effects of volcanic disturbance. And one of the key concepts here is that eruptions can alter the hydrologic functioning of the landscape. And so in this cartoon, this is a kind of an undisturbed landscape, pre-volcanically disturbed landscape. And what we see is we have our precipitation coming in. Our vegetation canopy will often intercept some percentage of that, possibly 10, 20% or more. Evapotranspirates back to the atmosphere. The throughfall that makes it to the ground surface, commonly, at least in the landscapes I've worked in and out here where I live, most of that throughfall will infiltrate to the landscape, and maybe you get a little bit of overland flow. With volcanic eruptions, then what will happen is that you can get a lot of vegetation damage and loss, as you can see here. In that upper right, or excuse me, the upper left photo, you can actually completely strip the landscape down to bedrock, removing all the vegetation and leaving bare landscape. You can topple the vegetation, as you see in the upper right. You can kind of bury and kind of coat the landscape, damaged vegetation, coat the landscape with tetrafall, as you see in the bottom 2 photographs. Now, when you deposit volcanic ash or tetrafall on the landscape, this can have a very significant effect on the infiltration rate or the capacity of the landscape, particularly if the material is
Yeah, I don't know what's going on, but it happened again, John.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what's going on. Sorry.
It's okay. I don't know
It's okay.
it's Zoom's own issues, but let's just try again.
Okay, let's see. So what are you seeing on my screen at the moment?
We're not seeing
You're
anything.
not seeing anything.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know
All
why
right.
screen share and audio drop. I have no idea what's going on.
Okay, let me try this. I'll try to share that screen again. And
all right, got it. Yeah.
Okay, and it's the one that says hydrologic effects of PDC and fault deposits?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll try to soldier on here. So what I want you just to take out of this is that the tephra that gets deposited on the landscape can have very significant impacts on the infiltration of water into the landscape. And the plot on the right is just some data that shows that as material gets finer and finer grained, infiltration rates can drop considerably. And just some photographs on the left to show you what some of this tetrafall can look like on the landscape. And let's try. Okay. These are just some data that show you kind of magnitudes of change in the infiltration rates on the landscape. This is some data from Mount St. Helens that was collected in the 1980s in the aftermath of the great volcanic eruption there, and then some data that I worked on collecting a couple decades later. And what you see is that pre-eruption, the infiltration capacity of the landscape here in the Cascades, where I live, was on the order of, say, 80 to 100 millimeters an hour. And then shortly after the 1980 eruption, infiltration rate capacities diminished by orders of magnitude down to something like 3 to 5 millimeters an hour. So an immense change. And so you can see that, even sort of the garden variety rainstorms generated overland flow, and that overland flow would then cause lots of sediment erosion. And even after almost 20 years, even though the infiltration capacities had recovered quite a bit, back up in the like 25 to 30 millimeter an hour range, still so the garden variety storms now no longer cause overland flow. They infiltrate into the landscape, but kind of the rare storms still have the capability of generating some overland flow on this landscape. So just a cartoon then. The top shows us kind of our pre-disturbance condition. The bottom shows kind of a post-disturbance condition. So what you see out of here, and all I want you to get out of this, is that now the precipitation input to the landscape, because we've damaged or lost a lot of vegetation, we have less interception and less evapotranspiration. And so we're letting more water get onto the landscape. And then with the tephra that's been deposited on the landscape, particularly if it's fine grained and has reduced the infiltration capacity, we're no longer infiltrating as much and we're allowing more of it to run off. Now, also, I will admit that if the tephra layer that's on the landscape is really coarse grained and sort of pumiceous, you can actually increase the infiltration and change the system from kind of a surface dominated system to one that's really sort of shallow, very shallow subsurface flow. And that can also change the dynamics of water movement on the landscape. But for purposes of this talk right now, we'll just focus on the finer grain material. So you reduce the infiltration capacity, you can generate a lot of excess runoff. These are just a few plots then to show what happens hydrologically. So these are plots of discharge in basins affected by the eruption of Mount St. Helens, plotted against a kind of a control basin. And all I want you to get out of this is that in these plots, the black regression, the black solid line is a regression through all those gray data. And all those gray data are pre-eruption hydrologic discharge data. And the black triangles are post-eruption data. And you can see the red regression line that fits those post-eruption data. So what you see generally here is that those regression lines are different. And so for a given discharge from our control basin, post-eruption, the discharges in the affected basins are greater. So we're getting more water into the river systems and we're getting it off the landscape faster, which is causing, higher discharges for a given sort of input of precipitation. Again, the Green River is a basin affected, and then Tilton River here in the bottom two is another basin that was not affected. And so you can see in the basin unaffected by the eruption, the regression lines basically overlap. And so it just kind of confirms that, there really isn't any change in hydrology in the unaffected basin. So all I want you to get out of those plots was that those hydrologic changes on the landscape led to larger floods under a given set of precipitation. So what are the geomorphic consequences of these hydrologic changes? So we trigger lots of hill slope erosion. We can get a lot of severe channel erosion. Secondary lahars become an issue. We can get quick and powerful floods. The water comes off the landscape more quickly, and the floods have a little more power, a little more oomph as they go through the river systems. You get a lot of efficient sediment transport. And the bottom line really is a lot of sediment is on the move in these landscapes in the aftermath of explosive volcanic eruptions. Key message here is that this volcanic sediment erodes very easily. And as we just mentioned, the principal sources are going to be the tephra that's been deposited on the landscape. If you look at the middle photograph on the right-hand side, you can actually trigger more landslides in areas that have been fairly stable. And typically what happens is you'll have this window of time where the vegetation that's been damaged, particularly trees, the roots have not decayed enough, so they're still capable of anchoring the sediment that was already on the landscape, perhaps from old eruptions. But over time, those roots begin to decay and weaken, and so you lose some of that stability, and you have not allowed enough new vegetation yet to grow up and begin to anchor the sediment. So you've kind of got this window where landslides become much more prevalent on the landscape. And so that's another way of putting sediment down into the systems. And then you get all the channel erosion from the sediment that's been in the river systems by these eruptions. And just to kind of illustrate this a little bit, I'll just call your attention to the upper right-hand photograph from Mount Pinatubo. As I mentioned, all that tan material is pyroclastic flow debris, probably on the order of 100 meters thick in that valley. Keep your eye on that rock knob that's kind of poking up amongst all that pyroclastic flow deposit, because after a year or two, that's the same rock knob right under the word Pinatubo, and you can see all the erosion that's taken place in that particular valley. I'll call your attention to the upper left-hand photo. This is a view looking down the river system at Mount St. Helens that was impacted by the big debris avalanche, that big landslide. So this is a kind of a 1980s photo. You can see the chaotic deposit. You can see there's no real through-going drainage. The drainage was completely disrupted. A whole new drainage network had to be reintegrated. And then here we have kind of a similar view, and you can now see the drainage systems that's redeveloped there, and all the erosion that's taken place. And then in the upper photo, the black and white photo in the upper middle column, that's just a view looking upstream at Mount St. Helens. In the valley, there's that big debris avalanche deposit. Again, you see no through-going drainage. So lots of erosion has to take place to reintegrate the system. And then this is a circa early 1990s photograph, and you can see the drainage systems that have redeveloped and eroded. And at Chaiten volcano, which is in the lower right-hand corner there, in one of the basins that was coated by lots of volcanic ashfall, one of those basins within a single week, in the aftermath of the eruption during a rainstorm, lost something like anywhere from 15 to 40% of the sediment on the hill slopes came flushing off and caused a huge problem downstream. These are just some data from Mount St. Helens to show kind of the long-term suspended sediment transport coming out of the different river systems affected by the eruption. And just a couple things I want you to take away from this plot. First of all, that horizontal dashed line is a proxy for what we think probable or possible pre-eruption sediment yield was. So, in kilotons per square kilometer. We don't have any pre-eruption data directly from those channels, but this is kind of an estimate based on a region-wide look at suspended sediment transport in the rivers around here. So that we use that horizontal black dashed line as a proxy for pre-eruption conditions. And so what you can see is that in the immediate aftermath of the eruption, the magnitude of sediment being flushed out of the river systems at Mount St. Helens was significantly above background level. And in the case of the Toutle River, which is the blue solid line, and the North Fork Toutle River, which is the valley that was affected by the big landslide deposit, which is the black line with the circles, we're upwards of almost 500 times above typical background level. So enormous flush of sediment in the immediate aftermath of the eruption. You can see that over time, those sediment yields dropped pretty rapidly. But over a long period of time, you can see that they bounce around, but they have remained above background level in the basins that we continued to gauge for decades. You'll see that after almost 40 years after the eruption, at least in a couple of the basins that we still continue to monitor, depending on how you want to average, we're still maybe on the order of 10 times above typical background level. So this excess sediment continues to flush down the system and continues to cause societal issues. So that's kind of the main thing. And the other thing I'll just note is that the gray bars and they kind of show that those are mean annual stream flows. So you can see there's also some correlation between dry years and low sediment yields coming off the landscape and wet years and higher sediment yield coming off the landscape. So that's all I really want you to take out of this. Just know that big flush of sediment in the immediate aftermath, pretty rapid drop off, but then we're kind of hit this plateau where we're elevated above background for many, many decades right now and possibly for decades to come. Bed load also can be quite high. This is just some estimates we made at Chaiten volcano. The photographs up at the top just show you kind of a delta that was growing from the river system draining Chaiten. You can see shortly after the eruption, so much sediment got the channel filled, the original channel filled. It caused a channel avulsion. So a new channel cut its way right through the middle of town. You can see the delta that has grown. And by looking at and tracking the growth of that delta, we were able to make some estimates of bed load fluxes. And so the bottom plot shows you bed load transport rates in kilograms per second per meter of channel width. And you can see, I mean, we're, early on, we're above 10, between 10 and 100. So we had some pretty high bed load transport rates. You can see they dropped off over time and kind of plateaued for a while. So again, even bed load transport, just reinforcing the fact that lots of sediment gets mobilized in the aftermath of these explosive eruptions. And then on a kind of a global scale, this is kind of an all-encompassing plot. All the gray are just sediment yields from non-volcanic river systems that I was able to compile from the literature. All the colored symbols represent sediment yields from volcanically disturbed river systems in the aftermath of various eruptions. And you can see that at least over the short term, these volcanic river systems, the sediment yields coming out of these can rival sediment-rich rivers around the world, at least on a square kilometer basis. And over a short time, these volcanic systems aren't going to continue to pump those rates out, for decades and decades and decades. But at least early on, they can rival some of the great sediment-producing rivers worldwide. So a key concept is that we have extraordinary post-eruption sedimentation in the aftermath of an eruption. The main impacts are that they can cause significant channel fill. You lose all your flood protection. As I mentioned at Chaiten volcano, you can actually get channel diversion. And it's very expensive for society to remove all this sediment that's flushing down the river systems. I think I'm just going to skip that one. So as I mentioned, when we looked at those data, we saw a pretty rapid drop off of the initially really high loads of sediment, and we kind of hit a plateau. And so following kind of this initial recovery, if you will, there's still a lot of sediment available for transport in the river systems. And typically what will happen is that you can still, at least at Mount St. Helens, we still continue to get pretty large releases of sediment during large storms. The main sediment source now, as you can see on these photographs on the right, is basically channel bank erosion. So we've still got a lot of sediment in the river system. We've got the initial channels that have been recarved and reintegrated. We're not doing a lot more incision right now, but we continue to nibble away at the channel banks. So a lot of unstable channel banks. And the digital terrain model is a DEM of difference from Mount St. Helens, and this represents a period from 1987 to 1989. And I just want to call your attention to the hot colors there in the middle of the DEM. And that just shows an area of intense erosion, kind of at least over that decade plus time frame. A lot of that erosion was kind of focused in that area. So we had a real hot spot of erosion there. And now here's a DOD from 1999 to 2009. And you can see we don't have any like real single hot spot of erosion. But if you look at it, you can see that the erosion is distributed a bit more. And if you really look at it closely, you can actually see that some of that, a lot of that erosion is focused on channel bends. So it's just re-emphasizing the fact that now it's channel bank erosion, much more so than incision, that's causing a lot of, continuing to keep the sediment loads elevated at Mount St. Helens. This is just a plot. I want to just show this. This is just, let's talk a little bit about landscape sensitivity. So this is just a plot of kind of hydrology in the upper North Fork Toutle River at Mount St. Helens. And again, that's the river system where the big landslide deposit ended up. So over time, this is almost 40 years of hydrologic data here. We've had some large floods over the decades, but a lot of the sediment has moved under river flows that are really not all that extreme, okay? Can't compare the orange and blue quite directly because these are two different gauges and the drainage areas are different. But just take away from the fact that, we've had a few large floods, But by and large, a lot of the river flow that's been moving a lot of this sediment out of the system has been kind of average, kind of garden variety stuff. It's not just moving by really big floods. So I'm going to show just a series of digital elevation models of difference that Kristen Sweeney compiled as part of her postdoc, just to kind of show you sort of how the landscape erodes and lights up over time. So here's a DOD from 1980 to 1981. You can see a drainage system is beginning to reform. It's not completely reconnected. We've got, these areas where sediment was accumulating in ponds that were developed on the landscape. So we're starting to get kind of a nascent drainage system reintegrating. From 1981 to 1982, a bit more of the integration is, taking place, still not really fully reintegrated. And then here we have a tremendous amount of erosion. And what was happening here is that the outlet to Spirit Lake had been blocked by the big debris avalanche. And so the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was actually pumping water out of Spirit Lake over the crest of the blockage and into a drainage system to maintain the lake level, to keep that lake from breaching. And you can see the amount of erosion that just fired up from all that pumping. And this was only being pumped at like 5 cubic meters per second. So this is pretty low flow, but it just shows you the sensitivity of the landscape and the sensitivity and how easily this material gets eroded, even under pretty low flow. This is 1987 to 1996. So you can see now we're kind of nibbling away more at the channel margins. 1996 was actually one of our larger floods. So we moved a lot of sediment, and a lot of it came from channel kind of lateral erosion. 1999 to 2003, hydrologically fairly quiet. We're not seeing a lot going on in the landscape there, a few places. And then 2003 to 2007, the landscape lights up again. And in November of 2006, we had another pretty good sized flood. So again, we're triggering, and this one actually triggered a fair bit of incision in the area. You see something called Lewitt Creek there. That area really lit up, a lot of incision there for some reason. But again, kind of, a little bit of an event-driven thing, really lit the landscape up. Then 2009 to 2015, just kind of continuing to nibble. Not much is going on hydrologically. 2015 to 2017, we did have another sizable runoff, but it didn't do a lot. It really just kind of mostly nibbled at the margins. So the key concept to come out of this right now is just that the sediment impacts can last years, decades, and possibly even centuries following these explosive volcanic eruptions. So sediment continues to move. Sometimes it can shut down fairly quickly, but in these really large events, it continues to flush down the systems for decades. And one of the things that we're going to try to do here at Mount St. Helens is to relook at some work. Various studies have been done to try to estimate how long these abnormal sediment loads will be coming down the river systems. And we're going to try to take a little bit of a look at that with some of the more modern tools and techniques we have today, and see if we can, maybe make a tighter forecast or a little bit better forecast of how long, at least at Mount St. Helens, these abnormal sediment loads will be anticipated to come down. But you can see that it causes, just huge societal problem. At Mount St. Helens, that upper right photograph, what they actually did was they built a very large, they call it a sediment retention structure. They're trying to trap as much of the sediment up close to the mountain as they can to keep it out of the lower river systems. Because in that lower right photo, you see that one of the ways they tried to deal with it was, constantly dredging the channel to maintain the flood protection and keep the shipping channels open. That's incredibly expensive, and eventually you run out of land to put all that sediment. So kind of bringing all this together, Karen Grant and her colleagues just kind of put together this schematic model of phases of post-eruption instability and erosion. And what they kind of are describing here is they've got two phases. And so in the first phase, the sediment yields are incredibly high, way above background level, as we saw at Mount St. Helens, possibly upwards of 500 times above background level. And it's due to hill slope, tephra erosion, kind of rill and gully network development, In the channels, you're getting network extension, you're kind of getting channel integration going on. And while all that's happening, you're pumping out enormous amounts of sediment. And then once your rill and gully networks start to get, once they're established, the amount of sediment coming off the hill slopes drops off pretty quickly, as shown here. Once the channel networks get reestablished, the amount of sediment diminishes somewhat. It diminishes largely because you're not doing as much incision. And then you enter this phase of channel widening. And then you move into this, what they call phase 2, and it's really dominated by channel widening and kind of nibbling of the channel margins. And then for some ill-defined long term, you continue to have lots of fluvial instability and continued erosion. And the big question is, exactly how long does that last? And so, new modeling efforts that we can try to bring to bear on those questions are kind of one of the directions I think that the future of this field is going to move. And it's one of the things we're going to try to move into more here at Mount St. Helens. One of the other things that we might be able to start trying to do is that there are now pretty sophisticated numerical models that can predict ashfall dispersion, ashfall trajectories, and actually fallout from these large ashfall plumes. And so if you can take some of those kinds of predictive models, make predictions of the dispersal and the grain size that's going to fall out of those plumes, and then you start to marry that with all those hydrologic changes, we might be able to start to predict in advance the areas where a lot of these hydrologic impacts are going to take place, and help the community planners sort of plan for that. So some of the mitigation efforts that have been done worldwide, I talked already about the dredging at Mount St. Helens, trapping and containment of sediment. We talked about this big sediment retention structure at Mount St. Helens. In Japan, rather than build like one single structure to try to trap sediment, Japan builds a lot of sabo dams, a lot of these little dams, and they try to trap sediment that way. Another thing I've seen in Japan, down at Sakurajima volcano, is to try to convey that sediment, get it away from the society, and get it out to the ocean as efficiently as possible. And so in the lower left there, this is the Nojiri River system, where they've basically turned it into a concrete canal so that they get a lot of debris flows that are triggered by erosion of the slopes up at Sakurajima volcano. And Sakurajima erupts very frequently, so it's constantly recharging the landscape with volcanic ashfall and tephra and then you trigger lots of debris flows. And so what they've done here is try to make this concrete canal to effectively, more efficiently convey that sediment out to the ocean and keep it from accumulating on the landscape and causing societal issues. And then that lower right is that Zunzen volcano, and they've done something similar. You can see they've tried to kind of engineer a drainage network that can more efficiently convey that sediment down and get it out to the ocean. So just big picture messages then. I think some of the things that I want you to take away from this are just that explosive eruptions can deposit vast amounts of sediment. They deposit vast amounts of sediment. They can fundamentally alter hydrologic runoff, and they can trigger exceptional post-eruption sediment transport. So probably biggest picture message. If we can begin improving our linkages among things like ashfall characteristics and infiltration and dispersal, I think that's really going to help us with our predictive modeling of where we're, to be able to anticipate where we're going to see a lot of these hydrologic impacts, and maybe, be able to provide some actionable information to community planners, things they can maybe help do to help minimize some of these hydrologic runoff issues. I think when we looked at some of the data, we saw that the sediment transport trends can reflect depletion and isolation and transitions from primary sources of sediments. But as I showed you, they also bear a pretty strong imprint of hydrologic variation. And so I think in the future, where we kind of need to go is try to get some better linkages among erosion transport and kind of hydrologic discharge to be able to make better long-term predictions, particularly of the channel systems, of how long, what's the duration of this excess sediment? How long are these impacts likely to last in different scenarios? And with, when you start to couple that then with kind of these climate modeling ensemble scenarios, we might be able to get a better sense of where we're going in the future. Let's say at Mount St. Helens, what's it going to look like for the next century? Say, how long are we going to be dealing with this abnormal sediment runoff that's coming down the river systems? Sediment sources are greatly affected by eruption magnitude and frequency. So we talked about, we can either have like a really big eruption that dumps everything on the landscape in sort of a single event, or if you've got eruptions that are prolonged and are constantly recharging the landscape, that has great impacts on how long these river systems and landscapes continue to respond to eruptions. And why do we even care about any of this? And one of the main reasons we care is that these prolonged post-eruption sediment transport issues can cause environmental and socioeconomic harms that can equal or exceed that caused directly by an eruption. And I'll kind of harken back to those photographs of that community near Chaiten volcano, and that community was not directly impacted by the eruption. So they sort of escaped, if you will, direct impact by the eruption, but it was all the sediment flush in the aftermath of that eruption that really devastated their community, caused filled the channel, caused the river to divert and avulse right through the middle of their community. So that was clearly a case where, it was kind of the aftermath sediment transport that did a lot more damage than the direct impact of the eruption itself. And I'll just close. Hopefully I've convinced you now that, there's an adage here in the US that, it says it ain't over till it's over. And I'd say that that's especially apt at Mount St. Helens. This past Saturday was the 44th anniversary of the May 1980 eruption. So after almost 45 years, after almost 45 years, typo there, almost 45 years after the events that transpired, kind of within just minutes on a single morning, society is still confronting very significant hydrologic geomorphic impacts. And so these issues can last for a long time and really have very serious societal consequences. And so with that, I'm going to unshare my screen because that's the end of the talk. So I thank everybody for listening and apologies for the technical glitches that we had.
Thank you, Dr. Mann. That was an excellent talk. I really enjoyed it. And now over to people who have joined us via Zoom. Please start and continue posting your questions. I think we already see one. So this is from Louise. Hi, thank you for this presentation. During your project, do you plan to compare evolution of sediment discharges between tropical and temperate environments?
That's not something we're specifically focusing on here right now. Some of those plots I showed you, particularly the kind of the global plot of sediment yields, I've managed to grab what data I could. Yeah, obviously the challenge is being able to get the sediment data, right, and being able to get the information to look at sediment transport, particularly over a time series. And these are data that they're hard to come by. I mean, there aren't a lot of places where we've got long-term records, but it is an interesting question. Probably I'd say in a more tropical climate, because you've got so much, water on the landscape all the time, or at least very frequently, then if it's just one eruption and it's kind of just, one instantaneous input of sediment to the landscape, and then, then all you're looking at is the aftermath, those environments are probably going to recover faster, right? Because you just got more water on the landscape. You're just constantly flushing things out. Most likely those systems are going to settle down maybe a little bit faster. But commonly in the tropics, a lot of those volcanoes erupt very frequently. And one example I'll look at is Irasu in Costa Rica. So back in the 1960s, when it erupted, it went through a period, it was a few years of eruption. It was just constantly recharging the landscape with sediment, much like Sakurajima that I showed you. And so it had a tremendous sediment flush that persisted for, many, many years, right? Because you were just constantly recharging the landscape. If you're in more of a high latitude landscape, you might get initial flushes early on, but then you might end up leaving a fair bit of that sediment on the landscape and just kind of nibble at it over time rather than really flushing it out all at once. So it could be that in those cases you end up something, say, more like Mount St. Helens, where you get just kind of this one big impact, but it's continuing to flush it out because here in our landscape, we get the occasional big flood, but mostly it's just, kind of relatively minor stuff. And so early on, we get the big flush, and now we just continue to nibble away. Mount Pinatubo, again, more of a tropical landscape. That was a huge, devastating landscape impact there. And, there's still a lot of sediment there that's continuing to flush out.
Yeah, thank you very much, John, for your talk. We have some more questions here. Just because we have a lot. I would like to ask the question from Moise Baraka that he's actually asking what are the guiding parameters that highly influence the flow patterns of volcanic eruptions? And if you see some potential research questions in this field, particularly in the context of environmental flow dynamics and so on.
Yeah, I think part of, some of the really influential, what are the parameters, right? So a lot of it is infiltration, right? How quickly are you getting the landscape, or how quickly are you getting the water off the landscape into the river systems and translating that change from runoff to kind of flooding in the river systems. And a lot of that really kind of depends on the characteristics of the sediment that are deposited on the landscape, right? At Mount St. Helens, at Chaiten, at Pinatubo, it was pretty fine-grained material on the landscape. So we really changed the infiltration capacity and caused a lot more overland flow, which really changed a lot of the hydrologic dynamics, at least, for some number of years. At Crater Lake here in the Cascades in the US, to the east of Crater Lake, the big caldera eruption there deposited a lot of really coarse grains tephra on the landscape. And at least to the east side of Crater Lake, it really changed it from kind of a typical Cascadian landscape to one where it's really now dominated by infiltration. You really don't get much in the way of kind of river system development. And so it's really become more of a spring-fed system there. And so it really kind of depends on the characteristics of the sediment that does get deposited on the landscape. So I think those are maybe some of the first order controlling variables. And so
Thank you for that answer. Vicky is asking about the data source and precision of the DEMs that you use for the elevation difference in the maps.
Yeah, so it was a combination of, we've got an extensive archive of vertical aerial photography. So a lot of that was, we took a lot of that vertical aerial photography and used structure from motion to help create DEMs. We have we probably have maybe 3 or 4, actually no more than that, LiDAR DEMs that were created, so a little more specific. So some of those DEMs of difference, it was comparing something created from aerial photography to one that was based on LiDAR. So that's why you saw some various artifacts and stuff in there, but a lot, that really fine time scale stuff was really based largely on aerial photography and using structure for motion. And Kristen Sweeney did a lot of that work.
Yeah, we also have a comment from Luis following up the question. They just mentioned about an opposite example in the tropical context that could be Monte Calais in Martinique, which last erupted in 1902.
Mm-hmm.
And the surrounding areas are still under Lahar arrest today, and data may be available from the 1930s regarding this volcano. So,
yeah, well, thanks for the comment. Yeah, Pelée was it was clearly kind of one of the key eruptions in the field of volcanology, particularly for the pyroclastic flows and things like that. So we really learned a lot about how those things form, and then the impacts of those on the landscape for sure.
Thank you. There is another question from Brian. The question is, are volcanic edifices persistent enough such that the river slopes adjust over longer time scales to better convey these inputs?
Could you just repeat the first part of that again?
Yeah, so Brian is curious about the feedback between the river system morphology and the persistent disturbances that you showed.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is that if the volcanic edifices, if they're persistent enough in these river slopes that can adjust over longer time scales to better input these, to better convey these inputs.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I didn't, that one slide I kind of skipped over a little bit was really talking a little bit about kind of frequency of disturbance versus kind of recovery time. And so if you're in a landscape where the recovery time is shorter than the frequency of eruptions, you're going to get this perturbation. The landscape's going to recover. It's going to recover to some equilibrium state, and that equilibrium state may or may not be the same as the pre-disturbance equilibrium state, but you'll recover to some sort of equilibrium state. On the other hand, if you're in a landscape, say, where the recovery time exceeds the frequency of the disturbance, you got a landscape it's sort of almost in perpetual state of recovery, right? You'll get a disturbance, it's starting to recover, you get the next disturbance. And so, here in the Cascades where I live, one can almost argue that this is a landscape here that's really almost constantly recovering from a disturbance of some sort. On average, our volcanoes erupt a couple times a century, which doesn't seem like a very long time. But here at Mount St. Helens, if that particular disturbance, if the recovery time really is, a couple centuries, then, you have that possibility of the next disturbance actually affecting the landscape before it's really recovered to some sort of an equilibrium status. So Brian, I don't know if that's kind of getting at a little bit of what you were trying to get at.
Yes, he just said thumbs up. Well, in the meantime, we're waiting for questions. I just curious about what are your thoughts. I heard that at the end you mentioned that you're implementing numerical modeling to see how the systems are responding, but in that also is considering somehow the climate change, because we know definitely that there is these geomorphologic changes that the river is going through, but is there a factor that you're also including in terms of perhaps more frequent peak flows or other ways that the glaciation also might be happening in the system in the case of St. Helens, for instance? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so one of the things we're hoping to do here is to try to do a better job of linking the sediment transport characteristics, and the hydrology. And then if we can get a pretty good linkage and we can do a pretty good job of predicting kind of the sediment yields we've seen to date, then what we want to do is, take that model and then try to link it to sort of a climate ensemble model that makes various predictions of what the future climate might be and what the hydrology might be like as we move into the future, and then see if we can then link kind of that transport model to some of those sorts of predictions of what the hydrology might be over the next, at least statistically over the next, say, 100 years, to get a better sense of how long we might see these abnormal sediment transport this abnormal sediment transport coming down the river systems of Mount St. Helens. Yeah, so the idea is to try to improve upon our numerical modeling to predict what we've already seen, and then start trying to link that to the kind of these climate ensemble models.
Yeah, well, we only have 2 more minutes left. If anyone would like to ask perhaps the last question. Okay. So we have a question from Aidan. He's asking about if you have any insight about how sediment flux following such eruptions behaves in Arctic areas, where frozen water in soil pores may increase soil cohesively and resistance to erosion.
Well, that's a great thought experiment. There aren't that many eruptions that have been studied in the Arctic areas with regard to the amount of sediment that's been put on the landscape and how it's responded. But yeah, that's a really interesting thought experiment to try to think about how an Arctic system might behave over time. Unfortunately, I can't offer you any particular insight right now.
Yeah, so I think that, well, that's all the questions that we have. Thank you one more time, Dr. Mayer, for joining us today. Thank you for sharing the aspects of your research with us, and we look forward for your future research outputs and to continue to learn more about the hydrogeomorphic responses to landscape disturbance from you and your research team. Thanks also for those who joined today.
All right, thank you all. Thanks for attending.
I guess
think
we'll just announce June via
Mhm.
social media later and mail servers.
Yes, yeah, I think that
All
would
right.
be a good plan.
All right. Well,